The first thing Graham Trask did after they lowered Daniel Sutton into the ground was unpin the star from his own vest and drop it into the grave before the first shovel of earth ever touched the pine box below. Nobody in Cedar Hollow tried to stop him. The wind off the Laramie Range was cutting through the cottonwoods that September morning in 1877, and the handful of mourners standing at the edge of the cemetery only watched as their marshal knelt in the dirt, pressed his hand once against the wood of the coffin, and let the tin badge fall from his fingers like it weighed more than the mountains behind him. "I could not keep him breathing," Graham said to no one and to everyone, his voice cracked open like dry earth after a drought. "I will not wear the thing that let me believe I could." The preacher did not argue. The undertaker did not argue. Even old Silas Boone, who had pinned that same badge on Graham 3 years before when he was still fool enough to think a young man with a fast draw and an honest face could keep a town safe, only removed his hat and bowed his head lower, because there was nothing left to say to a man who had just buried his own faith in himself alongside a boy of 22. Daniel Sutton had been Graham's deputy for 11 months. He had been quick to laugh, slow to anger, and altogether too brave for a boy who had never once been shot at before the day the Weller gang rode into Cedar Hollow to empty the bank and left him bleeding out in the dust of Main Street with 3 rounds in his chest, because Graham Trask had been 40 yards away chasing the wrong rider. That was the story Graham told himself every night since. That was the story that drove him out of the marshal's office 2 days after the funeral, out past the edge of town to a stretch of scrubland and sage that nobody else wanted, where he built himself a 1-room cabin and a horse corral, and told the town council when they came asking that Cedar Hollow would need to find itself another lawman because he was done being one. That had been a year ago. Now it was the summer of 1878, and Graham Trask was breaking horses instead of breaking up bar fights, and if his hands still remembered the weight of a revolver, he had trained them well enough to forget it during daylight hours, at least until the sun went down and the dreams came back to remind him. The stagecoach from Cheyenne pulled into Cedar Hollow on a Tuesday in the middle of June, throwing up a plume of dust that could be seen from the Trask ranch 2 miles out, though Graham paid it no mind. Stagecoaches came and went. They rarely had anything to do with him anymore, not since he had stopped being the man who met them at the depot to check for trouble. He did not know, that particular Tuesday, that the coach carried a woman named Helen Sutton, and that her arrival would undo a year of careful, deliberate forgetting. Helen had not wanted to come to Wyoming Territory. She had wanted, more than anything else in the world, for her younger brother to still be alive and writing her cheerful letters from his little house behind the marshal's office, letters full of talk about the mountains and the horses and the sheriff he worked under, a man named Trask who Daniel seemed to think hung the moon. But Daniel was dead, and the letters had stopped 11 months ago, and the lawyer in Cheyenne had written to inform Helen that her brother's homestead claim, 60 acres of grazing land just outside Cedar Hollow that Daniel had filed on before he died, now belonged to her by right of inheritance, and that if she did not travel out to improve the claim within the year, the land would revert to the territory. She had buried her mother 2 winters before. Her father had passed when she was 16. There was nothing left for her in the small Missouri town where she had grown up. No husband, no children, nothing but a dressmaking shop she had run since she was 20, and a loneliness that had settled into her bones, the way frost settles into fence posts. So when the lawyer's letter came, Helen Sutton sold the shop, packed 2 trunks and bought a ticket west, because 60 acres of Wyoming grassland was, at the very least, something that was still hers, something Daniel had wanted enough to risk everything for, and she was not about to let the territory take that back too. She stepped off the stagecoach into the dust and noise of Cedar Hollow's Main Street with her chin lifted and her back straight, the way her mother had taught her to stand when the world tried to tell her she did not belong somewhere. "You'll be wanting the Prescott boarding house, ma'am," the stage driver said, hauling her trunks down from the boot. "Just up the street there, past the mercantile." "Thank you," Helen said. "Can you tell me where I might find the town marshal's office?" The driver's face did something complicated, a flicker of discomfort passing behind his eyes before he answered. "Ain't been a marshal in Cedar Hollow for near a year now, ma'am. Not since young Sutton was killed and Trask turned in his star. Council's been dragging its feet on hiring a new one. You looking for the law about something?" Helen's throat tightened at the sound of her brother's name spoken so plainly by a stranger, as though Daniel were simply a fact of local history now, a marker of time the way people spoke of a bad winter or a drought year. "Sutton was my brother," she said. The driver's face changed again, softened. "I'm mighty sorry, ma'am. He was well liked around here." "Shame what happened." "What did happen?" Helen asked, though she already knew the bones of it from the lawyer's careful letter. She wanted the flesh of it, the truth that lived in the mouths of people who had been there. "Weller gang came through last September aiming to rob the bank," the driver said. "Your brother and Marshal Trask went out to stop them. Boy ran into gunfire trying to pull a couple of children out of the crossfire, from what I heard, and paid for it. Trask ain't been the same since. Quit the badge right there at the grave, folks say. Buried it with him." Helen stood very still in the dust and heat of the street, turning that last sentence over in her mind like a stone she could not put down. Buried it with him. She thought of a man burying his own authority, his own purpose, in the same hole as her brother, and she did not know whether to feel grateful that someone had grieved Daniel so deeply, or furious that the man responsible for keeping him alive had simply walked away from the job rather than face what had happened. "Where might I find this Trask?" she asked. The driver pointed west, past the edge of town. "Got himself a horse ranch out that way now. Keeps mostly to himself. You want, I can have my boy drive you out once you're settled." "I would appreciate that," Helen said, and did not examine too closely why her heart was beating harder than the June heat could account for. Graham Trask was mending a section of corral fence when he heard the wagon coming up the rutted track toward his cabin, and he straightened with a nail still between his teeth and his hammer loose in his hand, watching the dust rise in the distance the way a man watches whether he cannot yet name. He did not get many visitors. The Prescott boy driving the wagon he recognized, but the woman sitting beside him on the bench seat, in a gray traveling dress with her dark hair pinned beneath a modest bonnet, was a stranger, and something about the set of her jaw as the wagon drew close made the hammer in his hand feel suddenly heavier than it should have. "Afternoon, Marshal Trask," the Prescott boy called, though Graham had told him a dozen times not to use that title anymore. "Got a lady here asking after you." Graham set the hammer down against a fence post and wiped his hands on his trousers before he approached the wagon, and it was only when the woman turned her face fully toward him, when he saw the particular shape of her eyes and the stubborn line of her mouth, so achingly familiar it struck him like a physical blow, that he understood who she must be. "You're his sister," Graham said before she had spoken a single word. "Daniel's sister." Helen's chin lifted a fraction higher. "Helen Sutton," she said. "I believe you knew my brother." The nail Graham had been holding between his teeth fell into the dirt, unnoticed. For a long moment he only stood there, hat in hand now though he did not remember removing it, staring up at the woman on the wagon seat as though she were something conjured out of the very guilt that lived in his chest. "I knew him," Graham said finally, his voice rough. "I trained him. I was supposed to look after him." "Yes," Helen said, and there was no accusation in the word yet, only a terrible, careful evenness, the sound of a woman holding a great deal of feeling very still. "I understand that is so." Nobody spoke for a moment. The Prescott boy shifted uncomfortably on the bench seat, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "I have come to improve my brother's claim," Helen said at last. "The 60 acres east of the creek. I am told it borders your land." "It does," Graham said. "Runs along the whole west fence line of my property." "Then I expect we will be neighbors," Helen said, and there was something in the way she said it, some current of challenge beneath the polite words, that told Graham this was not a woman who had come merely to farm 60 acres of grass. She had come, at least in part, to look the man who had failed her brother square in the face and see what manner of creature he truly was. Graham found he could not blame her for that. He had wondered the same thing about himself for the better part of a year and had not yet arrived at an answer he could live with. "I would be glad to help you get settled if you'll allow it," he said. "The homestead cabin your brother started, it isn't finished. Only got the walls up before he was called back to town duties. I could send some men to help complete it or do the work myself. Least I can do." "I did not come here for your charity, Mr. Trask," Helen said, and now the current beneath her words surfaced fully, sharp as broken glass. "I came here for what belongs to me by right, what my brother worked and died for. I do not need you to atone for whatever happened by hammering nails into my walls." Graham absorbed the words the way a man absorbs a blow he knows he has earned, without flinching, without argument. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I don't suppose you do." He stepped back from the wagon then, and touched the brim of his hat, and told the Prescott boy the quickest route to the homestead claim, and watched the wagon roll away east toward the creek without another word passing between himself and Helen Sutton, though he stood in the yard long after the dust had settled, staring at the empty road, feeling the old wound in his chest open fresh again, as though it had never had the chance to close at all. The homestead cabin Daniel Sutton had begun was little more than 3 walls of raw pine logs and a dirt floor, open to the sky where a roof should have been, and standing inside it for the first time, running her hand along the timber her brother had cut and notched and raised with his own hands, Helen Sutton finally allowed herself to weep. She had not cried at the funeral, 3 days after word reached her in Missouri, because there had been no funeral for her to attend, only a letter and a small tin box of Daniel's personal effects that the marshal's office had shipped east, a pocket knife, a photograph of their mother, and a letter Daniel had apparently been writing to Helen the very week he died, unfinished, the last line trailing off mid-sentence about a girl in town he had been thinking of courting. She had not cried in the weeks of settling her mother's affairs, nor in the long days of packing up the dress shop, nor on the train west, nor on the stagecoach into Cedar Hollow. She had held the grief inside her like a held breath, because there had been so much to do, so many practical matters demanding her attention, that sorrow had felt like a luxury she could not afford. But standing inside the unfinished walls her brother had built, smelling the pine sap that still clung faintly to the wood even after a year of rain and sun, Helen finally let the breath go, and wept until her whole body ached with it, sitting on the dirt floor of the home Daniel had never gotten to live in, surrounded by the bones of a future that had been stolen from him. She did not hear the horse approach until it was nearly at the cabin door, and when she looked up, wiping furiously at her eyes, she found Graham Trask standing in the open doorway with his hat in his hands, having clearly ridden over from his own ranch, and clearly having heard her before she noticed him. "I did not mean to intrude," Graham said. "I only came to bring lumber, for the roof. I thought perhaps you would let me leave it even if you won't let me raise it." Helen scrambled to her feet, embarrassed to be caught in such a state, and swiped once more at her face though the tears would not entirely stop. "You should not have come," she said, though the words carried less venom than they had that morning. "No," Graham agreed, "probably not." He did not leave, though. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, looking at her with an expression she could not quite name, something that held both sorrow and a kind of aching gentleness, and then he said quietly, "He talked about you. Daniel did, all the time. Said his sister ran the finest dress shop in Missouri, and had a temper that could peel paint off a barn door when she was crossed, and a heart soft enough to take in every stray cat in the county." Helen let out a sound that was half sob, half startled laugh. "That does sound like something he would say. He was proud of you," Graham said. "Talked about visiting you someday once he'd saved enough to bring you out here permanent. Said Wyoming needed a good dressmaker. The tears came again, but softer now, less like drowning and more like rain after a long drought. "Tell me what happened to him," Helen said. "Not the story the stage driver knows, not the story the newspapers printed. I want to know what you know, Mr. Trask, because I have carried a version of it in my head for 11 months, and I think it is time somebody who was there told me the truth of it." Graham was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat over in his hands. "You should sit," he said finally. "It is not a short telling." They sat together on a fallen log outside the unfinished cabin, the June sun sliding lower behind the mountains, and Graham Trask told Helen Sutton, for the first time since it happened, the whole truth of the day her brother died. "The Weller gang had been working the territory for the better part of 2 years," Graham began. "Reuben Weller and 4 other riders, robbing stage lines and small banks, always moving before word could reach the next town over. We had wired warnings from Cheyenne that they might be headed our way, but warnings like that came through every month or so, and most times nothing came of it." "But this time something did," Helen said. "This time something did," Graham agreed. "They hit the bank at 10:30 in the morning when the street was busiest. I was 2 doors down at the livery when I heard the first shot. Daniel was closer, right outside the bank itself on his morning rounds." Graham's hands had gone still in his lap and his eyes had gone distant, seeing something Helen could not see. "There were children on the street," he continued. "The Marsh family's 2 little ones, playing near the horse trough while their mother shopped in the mercantile. When the shooting started, they froze right there in the open, right in the line of fire between Weller's men and the bank door. Daniel saw them before I did. I was still running down the street, still 40 yards off, chasing the man who'd gone around back to cut off any escape through the alley, because I thought that was where the real danger was. And Daniel went for the children," Helen said softly, already knowing from the shape of the story where it must end. "He went for the children," Graham confirmed. "Threw himself between them and the gunfire, and got them behind the trough, safe, both of them, not a scratch on either child. But in doing it he stepped into open ground, and Weller's men, they weren't particular about who they shot at once the lead started flying. He took 3 rounds doing what any decent man would have done, what I would like to think I would have done, if I had been close enough to do it myself instead of chasing a rider who got away clean regardless." Helen was crying again, but she did not look away from Graham's face. "I got to him within a minute," Graham said, his voice breaking now, the careful control finally giving way. "Held him right there in the street while the doctor came running. He was still talking, right up near the end. Told me to tell his sister he was sorry he never got to bring her out here like he'd promised. Told me the children were safe, kept asking if the children were safe, like that was the only thing that mattered to him in that whole terrible minute. I told him, yes, they're safe, Daniel. You saved them, and he smiled, and then he was gone. For a long time neither of them spoke. The sun continued its slow slide toward the mountains, painting the unfinished cabin walls gold and then amber and then a deep, bruised purple. I have hated you for 11 months, Helen said finally, very quietly. I built you into a villain in my mind, Mr. Trask. A careless lawman who let a boy die because he was somewhere else, doing something less important. It was easier than hating the men who actually pulled the triggers, because they were nameless to me, riders who vanished into the hills, but you had a name and a face, and I could pour all my grief into you instead of into the empty space where my brother used to be. I have hated myself for the same 11 months, Graham said. For much the same reasons, I expect. But that is not what happened, is it? Helen said. Not really. You went where the danger seemed greatest. Daniel went where the danger truly was. Nobody failed him. He simply loved those children more than he loved his own safety. And that is a terrible, beautiful thing. And it is not your fault. Or if it is, then it is mine too, for not teaching him to value his own life a little more highly. And it is Reuben Weller's, most of all, for putting a gun in the street in the first place. Graham looked at her then, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for nearly a year loosened, just slightly, just enough for him to breathe a little deeper than he had in months. "I buried my badge with him," Graham said. "Did the stage driver tell you that part too?" "He did. I could not wear it after that. Every time I looked at it I saw Daniel's face, asking me if the children were safe, and I could not reconcile the star with a man who let that happen on his watch, even if you are kind enough now to say it was not truly a failure of mine." "Do you believe that?" Helen asked. "That it was not your failure?" Graham considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Some days," he admitted. "Other days I still believe if I had been faster or smarter or simply standing in a different part of the street, he would still be alive. I do not think that feeling goes away easily, Miss Sutton. I have tried." "No," Helen said. "I do not imagine it does. Grief is not so obliging as that." They sat together a while longer as the first stars came out over the Laramie Range, two people bound by loss neither of them had chosen. And when Graham finally rose to ride back to his ranch, he paused at his horse and looked back at her. "I would still like to help finish this cabin," he said. "Not as atonement, only because it seems a shame to leave the last thing Daniel built standing open to the weather, and because you should not have to raise walls alone if you do not have to." Helen studied him for a long moment in the dying light. "I will think on it," she said, which was not a yes, but was no longer entirely a no, and Graham found, riding home under the wide Wyoming stars, that it was enough to be going on with. Over the following weeks, Helen Sutton discovered that homesteading 60 acres of Wyoming grassland alone was a great deal harder than the lawyer's letter had made it sound, and that pride, however satisfying, did not keep the rain out or the roof up. It was the roof that finally undid her resolve. A hard summer storm rolled down off the mountains in the second week of July, and Helen spent the whole of one miserable night huddled in the corner of the cabin under an oilcloth tarp, listening to rain hammer through the open rafters and pool on the dirt floor around her. And by morning, she had decided that pride was a fine thing to have when it did not leave a woman sleeping in mud. She rode her brother's old mare into town that same day, found Graham Trask at the mercantile buying nails, and told him without preamble that she had reconsidered his offer. "The roof," she said, "if you are still willing." Graham's face did something complicated, relief and gladness mixed with a carefulness that told her he did not want to seem triumphant over her change of heart. "I am still willing," he said. "I will bring the lumber out tomorrow if that suits." It suited. And so began a strange, careful courtship that neither of them named as such at first, built out of roof beams and fence posts and long afternoons of shared labor under the wide sky. Graham brought 2 ranch hands to help raise the roof, and within a week the cabin had a proper shingled top that kept the rain where it belonged. Helen, in turn, insisted on feeding the men who worked, and found herself, more often than not, cooking for Graham alone in the evenings after the others had gone home, the two of them sitting on the cabin's new front step, eating beans and cornbread and talking about small things, and then, gradually, about larger ones. "Tell me about him as a boy," Helen said one evening, when the work on the cabin was mostly finished and there was less practical reason for Graham to still be there, though he came anyway, most nights, on some pretext or other. "You knew him only as a man. I knew him as a boy who used to follow me around the dress shop stealing pins." So Graham told her about the Daniel he had known, the eager young man who had ridden into Cedar Hollow at 21 looking for deputy work, all long limbs and earnest questions, who had asked Graham to teach him everything he knew about being a lawman, and had then, infuriatingly, tried to do everything better and faster than Graham had ever managed himself. "He used to practice his draw in front of the jailhouse window," Graham said, laughing at the memory in a way that surprised him, that first genuine laugh he had allowed himself in nearly a year. "Thought nobody could see him doing it. Half the town used to stop and watch, and he never once noticed the audience he'd gathered." Helen laughed too, a real laugh, the kind that came from deep in her chest, and Graham realized he had never actually heard her laugh before, not properly, and that he wanted very badly to hear it again. "He wrote to me about a girl," Helen said more quietly now. "In his last letter said there was someone in town he was thinking of courting, though he never gave a name." Graham went still. "Sarah Prescott," he said. "The boarding house owner's daughter. He'd been sweet on her most of that spring." "I believe she felt the same, though nothing had come of it yet, not properly, before he died." "Is she still here, in Cedar Hollow?" "She is. Married now to a rancher from over toward Chugwater. She grieved him something terrible, from what I understand." Helen nodded slowly, filing this piece of her brother's life away like a keepsake, another small window into who he had been in his last months. "I should like to meet her sometime," she said, "if she would be willing." "I think she would like that very much," Graham said. It was on an evening in early August, with the cabin fully finished and a small vegetable garden already sprouting green shoots in neat rows behind it, that Helen finally asked Graham the question that had been building in her mind for weeks. "Why did you truly give up the badge?" she asked. "Not the version you gave the town council. The truth." Graham was quiet for a long while, watching the last light drain from the sky. "Because I was afraid," he said finally. "Not of dying. I had made peace with that possibility the day I first pinned on a star. I was afraid of failing someone else the way I believed I failed Daniel. Every time I imagined putting that badge back on, I saw his face. I could not trust my own hands anymore, Helen. Could not trust myself to be fast enough, careful enough, to keep another soul alive when it mattered most." It was the first time he had used her given name, and Helen noticed it and did not correct him. "You cannot spend your whole life afraid of failing," Helen said gently. Daniel was not afraid in that street. He simply did what needed doing, and it cost him everything, but it saved 2 children who are alive today because of him. That is not a story of failure, Graham. That is a story of courage, however much it grieves us both. "I know that," Graham said. "I have known it somewhere for a while now. Knowing it and believing it deeply enough to trust myself again, those are 2 different mountains, and I have only just begun to climb the second one." Helen reached over in the gathering dark and took his hand, and neither of them spoke of it further that night. But something had shifted between them, some final wall coming down as surely as the cabin's roof had gone up. And when Graham rode home under the stars that night, he found himself thinking, for the first time in nearly a year, of a future rather than only the past. The trouble, when it came, arrived on a Thursday in the last week of August, carried into Cedar Hollow by a rider from Fort Laramie who brought word that had the whole town buzzing with alarm before noon. Reuben Weller had escaped custody in Cheyenne, where he had been awaiting trial for a robbery committed after the one that had killed Daniel Sutton. And word from the territorial marshal's office was that Weller had sworn, to anyone who would listen in the jail, that he intended to return to Cedar Hollow to finish what his gang had started, because the bank there still held, in his mind, an unfinished debt. Graham heard the news from the Prescott boy, who rode out to the ranch in a lather of excitement and fear to deliver it, and felt the old cold dread settle into his stomach like a stone dropped into a well. "How many riders with him?" Graham asked. "Don't know for certain," the boy said. "Word is at least 3 broke out with him. Could be more's joined since." Graham thanked the boy and sent him on to spread the word further, and then stood alone in his yard for a long time, staring east toward town, feeling the shape of an old fear reasserting itself, and beneath it, something new and more urgent. The knowledge that Helen Sutton's homestead sat directly along the route any rider coming down from the north would likely travel, and that if Weller meant to come for Cedar Hollow, he would pass within a quarter-mile of her cabin doing it. He saddled his horse within the hour and rode for Helen's place at a hard gallop. Helen was in her garden when he arrived, and the look on Graham's face as he swung down from his horse told her before he spoke a single word that something was badly wrong. "Reuben Weller has escaped from custody," Graham said. "He is coming back this way, or means to, according to what word has reached Fort Laramie. I need you to come stay in town until this is settled, Helen. I will not have you out here alone if there is even a chance he rides this direction." Helen's face went pale, but her voice when she spoke was steady. "The man who killed my brother. Yes, and the town has no marshal to face him." The truth of that landed on Graham like a physical weight. Cedar Hollow had gone 11 months without a lawman, the council too slow and too cheap to properly fill the post, relying instead on the loose promise that if trouble came, deputized townsmen could handle it, a promise that had never truly been tested. "No," Graham said quietly. "It does not." Helen studied him for a long moment, and Graham could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the same calculation he had been avoiding making himself since the moment the Prescott boy delivered his news. "You have to go back," she said. "Don't you? You have to put the badge back on." "I buried that badge, Helen. It went into the ground with your brother. I do not have another." "Then get another," Helen said, and there was iron in her voice now, the same iron that had carried her across half a continent to claim 60 acres of grassland rather than let it slip through her fingers. "Graham Trask, I have watched you spend a year punishing yourself for a death that was not your failure, and I understand that grief. I have lived beside it myself. But there is a difference between honoring a man's memory and hiding from the very thing he died doing. Daniel did not die because he wore a badge. He died because he loved this town enough to protect it, badge or no badge. If Reuben Weller is truly coming back, this town needs someone willing to do what Daniel did, and I do not believe there is another man within 100 miles better suited to that than you." Graham stood in the garden, the summer wind moving through the rows of beans and corn Helen had planted with her own 2 hands, and felt something inside him that had been frozen solid for nearly a year finally begin, painfully, to thaw. "If I go back," he said slowly, "if I take up a badge again and something happens to me, I would not blame you for hating me for it, the way you hated me before, for leaving you the way Daniel left you." "I would not hate you," Helen said, stepping closer, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something else besides, something that had been growing quietly between them for weeks now, unspoken but unmistakable. "I would grieve you terribly, Graham Trask, because somewhere in these past 2 months I have gone and fallen in love with you. God help me, loving a man who spends half his waking hours convinced he is unworthy of being loved at all. But I would not hate you for choosing courage. I only ask that you not choose it alone. Let this town help you. Let me help you. You do not have to carry Cedar Hollow's protection on your shoulders the same friendless way you carried Daniel's death." Graham crossed the last few feet of garden between them and took Helen's face in his hands, gentle as he had ever been gentle with a spooked horse, and looked at her for a long moment as though memorizing every line of her. "I have loved you since the day you sat on that log outside your brother's unfinished cabin, and forgave me for a sin I had not even committed," he said. "I did not think I deserved to say so, not with everything still unsettled between us, but I find I cannot wait any longer to tell you, not with Weller riding this direction and no certainty of tomorrow." "Then tell me," Helen whispered. "I love you, Helen Sutton. I have loved you for weeks. I think perhaps I loved you a little from the very first afternoon, when you told me you did not want my charity, and I realized I wanted, more than anything, to be worthy of something better than charity from you." Helen closed the last small distance between them and kissed him, there in the garden among the beans and the corn, with the mountain standing tall and indifferent behind them and the whole uncertain future of the territory stretched out ahead. And for a moment, just a moment, the fear of Reuben Weller and everything he threatened receded far enough that there was only the 2 of them, and the astonishing, hard-won fact of loving and being loved in return. When they finally parted, Graham's face had settled into something Helen had not seen there before, a kind of quiet resolve that reminded her, achingly, of the way Daniel used to look before he went out to do something difficult and necessary. "I am going to ride into town," he said. "I am going to ask the council to swear me in again, properly this time, and I am going to organize whatever men are willing to stand with me if Weller comes. But I want you safely inside town limits before any of that happens, Helen. Promise me that much." "I promise," Helen said, "on the condition that you promise me something in return. Name it, that you come back to me. Whatever happens with Weller, whatever it costs, you find your way back to me when it is finished, because I have already buried one man I loved in this territory, Graham Trask, and I do not intend to bury a second." Graham pressed his forehead to hers, breathing in the moment, letting it settle into his bones the way he intended to let it carry him through whatever was coming. "I promise," he said. "I have unfinished business with this life now, Helen. I intend to come back and finish it with you, if you will have me." They rode into Cedar Hollow together that afternoon, Helen's few belongings packed hastily into a single trunk, and the town, when they arrived, was already alive with the particular nervous energy of a place bracing for trouble. Word of Weller's escape had spread through every household by noon, and men were gathering outside the mercantile in tight, worried knots, talking in low voices about rifles and ammunition, and whether it was true the outlaw had sworn revenge on the very street where Daniel Sutton had died. Graham left Helen at the Prescott boarding house, promising to return before dark, and rode directly to the town hall, where he found the council already in a state of near panic, arguing amongst themselves about whether to send to Fort Laramie for cavalry protection or simply barricade the bank and hope for the best. "Marshal Trask," old Silas Boone said, rising from his chair with an expression of profound relief the moment Graham walked through the door. "I take it you've heard." "I have heard," Graham said. "And I have come to ask you to swear me back in if the council will have me." The room went quiet. Boone studied Graham's face for a long moment, searching perhaps for some sign of the broken man who had walked out of this very office a year before, and finding instead something steadier, something that had not been present in Graham's bearing in a very long time. "You understand what you're asking," Boone said carefully. "Weller has sworn to come back for this town specifically. If he does, and if there's a fight, it will not be a small one." "I understand it entirely," Graham said. "I have understood it for a year, Silas, whether I wore the badge or not. I only failed to understand until today that running from that understanding never once made this town safer. It only made me feel safer, and that is a poor trade for a man who once swore an oath to protect people other than himself." Boone's eyes were wet, though he blinked hard and cleared his throat before anyone could remark on it. "Then raise your right hand, son," he said, "and let's make this official." Graham Trask took the oath of office for the second time in his life in the cramped little town hall of Cedar Hollow, promising to protect the town and its citizens to the best of his ability. So help him God. And when Silas Boone produced a spare badge from the desk drawer where it had sat unused for nearly a year, waiting, perhaps, for exactly this moment, and pinned it to Graham's vest with his own trembling hands, something in Graham's chest finally settled into place. The way a bone sets after a long, painful break. Word came 2 days later that Weller and his men, now numbering 5 riders in total, had been sighted crossing the North Platte 40 miles distant, moving steadily southeast towards Cedar Hollow at an unhurried pace that suggested a man in no rush, confident in his own reputation, certain that a town without a proper marshal would fall easily before him. Graham spent those 2 days doing everything in his power to ensure Weller found a very different town than the one he expected. He deputized 6 men from among the ranchers and shopkeepers of Cedar Hollow, men who had watched Daniel Sutton die in the street the year before, and who did not intend to watch it happen again to anyone else if they could help it. He drilled them in the alley behind the jailhouse, teaching them to hold a position, to communicate with hand signals, to think before firing rather than simply reacting to noise and fear. All the careful, patient instruction he wished. Now, he had given Daniel more thoroughly in the months before the boy's death. He arranged with the bank manager to move the majority of the bank's cash reserves to a strongbox hidden in the back room of the mercantile, leaving only a modest amount in the vault itself, enough to seem worthwhile to a man planning a robbery, but not enough to make the theft catastrophic to the town's finances if Weller somehow succeeded despite everything. And on the second night, unable to sleep, he rode out past the edge of town to the small cemetery where Daniel Sutton lay buried, and stood at the grave for a long while in the moonlight, his new badge catching a faint gleam of silver light against his vest. "I do not know if you can hear me," Graham said quietly to the simple wooden marker. "I expect you cannot, and this is only an old fool talking to the dirt, but I wanted you to know I have taken up the badge again. Your sister convinced me, though I suspect some part of you had a hand in it too, wherever you are. I mean to do right this time, Daniel. I mean to be fast enough and smart enough and careful enough, and if I am not, if this goes the way it went before, I hope you will understand that I did not choose this path lightly, and that I have never once, in a whole year of grieving, forgotten what you gave to save those children." The wind moved through the cottonwoods above the little cemetery, and Graham chose to believe, standing there in the dark, that it carried something like forgiveness, something like blessing, on its way past him and out across the wide Wyoming grassland. Reuben Weller and his 4 riders came into view on the north road at 9:30 in the morning on the 4th day, exactly as the lookout Graham had posted on the church tower had warned they would, riding at a slow, deliberate walk down the center of Cedar Hollow's Main Street, as though they owned every inch of ground beneath their horses' hooves. Graham stood in the street to meet them, alone at first, his deputies concealed at careful positions along the storefronts on either side, rifles ready but out of sight, exactly as they had drilled. Reuben Weller was a broad, weathered man of perhaps 45, with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, and eyes as flat and cold as a winter pond. He reined his horse to a stop 30 feet from where Graham stood and studied him with something between amusement and contempt. "Well now," Weller said, "word reached me you'd given up the badge, Trask, buried it in the ground with that fool deputy of yours. Seems the rumors were wrong." "Seems they were," Graham agreed, his voice steady, his hand resting easy but ready near his revolver. "You have come a long way to find a very different town waiting for you than the one you left, Reuben." Weller's mouth curled into something that might have been a smile on a kinder face. "One badge and a handful of frightened shopkeepers ain't going to stop me from finishing what I started here, Trask. That bank owes me for the trouble your boy caused last year, getting himself killed in my way like that." The words landed exactly as Weller intended them to, a deliberate cruelty aimed to provoke, and Graham felt the old grief rise in his chest, hot and sharp, but he had spent 2 days preparing not just his deputies but himself for this exact moment, and he did not let the fury show on his face. "Daniel Sutton died saving 2 children from your gunfire," Graham said. "That is not trouble he caused you, Reuben. That is a debt you owe him and this whole territory that you will never be able to repay, not if you live 100 years. You are not owed anything here except a length of rope and a fair trial, and I intend to see you get exactly that, one way or another today." Weller's men shifted uneasily on their horses, sensing perhaps that this was not proceeding the way their leader had promised it would, and Weller himself, seeing the confidence in Graham's stance and hearing something in his voice that had not been there in whatever reputation had preceded him, hesitated for just a moment too long. "Drop your weapons," Graham said, loud enough now to carry down the whole length of the street. "Every one of you, right now, and you will live to stand trial in Cheyenne. Reach for a gun instead, and my deputies, who are currently aiming rifles at each and every one of you from the buildings on both sides of this street, will not hesitate to do what needs doing." For one long, terrible moment, nobody moved. Weller's eyes flicked left and right, taking in, for the first time, the barrels of rifles now visible in the windows and doorways of the mercantile, the boarding house, the barber shop. 6 weapons trained on 5 riders who had ridden into town expecting an easy morning's work and found instead a town that had learned, hard and bitter, exactly what it cost to be unprepared. It was one of Weller's men, a nervous, younger rider named Corey Fitch, who broke first, his hand darting for his revolver in a moment of pure panic, and the street erupted into chaos. Graham drew and fired in the same motion. He had practiced 10,000 times in the years before Daniel's death, and had not allowed himself to practice once in the year since. And his shot took Fitch through the shoulder, before the young outlaw's gun had even cleared its holster, spinning him from his horse into the dust of the street. The deputies opened fire from their concealed positions a heartbeat later, and two more of Weller's riders went down in quick succession, one grazed and howling, one struck more seriously and slumping forward over his saddle horn. Weller himself, seeing his advantage evaporate in the space of 5 seconds, wheeled his horse and spurred hard for the mercantile's front window, apparently intending to use it as cover. And Graham, seeing the movement, broke into a run across the open street directly into the line of any remaining fire, exactly the kind of exposed, dangerous position that had haunted his nightmares for a year. But this time there was no hesitation in him, no fatal delay of decision. He closed the distance to Weller's horse in seconds, grabbed the outlaw's coat, and hauled him bodily from the saddle before Weller could bring his own weapon fully to bear, the two men crashing together into the dust of the exact street where Daniel Sutton had died 11 months before. Weller fought hard, older and heavier than Graham but desperate now, cornered. And for a moment the two men grappled in the dirt, Weller's hand closing around the grip of his revolver, even as Graham fought to keep the barrel pointed away from himself, and the townspeople watching from doorways and windows all along the street. It was the memory of Daniel, oddly, that gave Graham the final surge of strength he needed, the memory of a boy who had thrown himself into danger without a second thought to save 2 frightened children. And Graham twisted hard, wrenching the revolver from Weller's grip and driving his fist into the outlaw's jaw with enough force to end the struggle entirely, leaving Reuben Weller stunned and bleeding in the dust of Cedar Hollow's Main Street, finally, fully defeated. The remaining 2 riders, seeing their leader captured and 3 of their fellows down, threw up their hands in surrender before Graham had even fully risen from the dirt. And it was over, the whole terrible confrontation lasting perhaps 90 seconds from the first shot to the last man's surrender, though it would feel, in the retelling over the following weeks, like it had stretched across an entire lifetime. Graham stood in the street, breathing hard, his new badge dusty but still pinned firmly to his vest, and looked around at the town he had sworn, twice now, to protect, and found it standing whole and safe around him, its people emerging cautiously from doorways to stare at the scene, disbelief and relief warring on every face. It was Helen who reached him first, running down the boardwalk from the Prescott boarding house where she had been waiting, forbidden by Graham from watching but unable to stay away once the shooting started, and she threw her arms around him right there in the street, in full view of the whole town, not caring in the slightest what anyone might think of such an unrestrained display. "You are unhurt," she said, pulling back just far enough to search his face, her hands trembling as she checked him for wounds she was relieved not to find. "You are truly unhurt." "I am," Graham said, and then, because he could not help himself, because the joy and relief of the moment demanded some expression larger than words, he kissed her, right there in the street, in front of Silas Boone and the deputies and half of Cedar Hollow, and nobody watching thought it anything but exactly right. Reuben Weller and his surviving men were held in the town jail that night under heavy guard, awaiting transport to Cheyenne to stand trial, and the town of Cedar Hollow, for the first time in nearly a year, slept soundly, knowing its streets were watched over by a marshal who had proven himself, in the most difficult possible circumstances, entirely worthy of the badge he wore. The trial in Cheyenne, when it came in October, was swift. Reuben Weller was convicted on multiple counts of robbery and murder, including, at last, formal acknowledgement of his role in the death of Deputy Daniel Sutton the previous September, and sentenced to hang, a sentence carried out before the year was through. His surviving riders received long prison terms at the Territorial Penitentiary. The Weller gang, which had terrorized the region for 2 years, ceased to exist, and Cedar Hollow, along with half a dozen other small towns across the territory that had lived under the shadow of Weller's reputation, finally exhaled. Graham Trask testified at the trial, and Helen Sutton sat in the gallery beside him, and when the judge read the guilty verdict aloud, she reached over and took Graham's hand, and neither of them cried exactly, though something in both their chests finally, fully released a grief that had been carried too long and too heavily. They rode back to Cedar Hollow together on the stage, and somewhere on that long, dusty journey across the territorial grassland, with the mountains rising blue and distant on the horizon, Graham reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box he had been carrying nervously for 3 days. "I bought this in Cheyenne," he said, "though I confess I have been working up the courage to give it to you since we left." Helen's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, modest but carefully chosen, exactly the kind of ring a practical woman who ran a dress shop and homesteaded 60 acres of grassland alone might actually want to wear every day of her life. "Helen Sutton," Graham said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, "I have already told you that I love you, and I meant it as fully as I have ever meant anything in my life. I am asking you now, in front of no one but the mountains and this stagecoach driver who is doing a very poor job of pretending not to listen, whether you will marry me. I cannot promise you a life without danger, not married to a lawman in this territory, but I can promise you that I will never again let fear keep me from doing what is right, and I can promise you that I will spend every day I am given trying to be worthy of the love you have offered me." Helen looked at the ring and then at Graham's face, weathered and earnest and finally fully at peace with itself, and felt her own heart answer before her mouth caught up to it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Graham Trask, I will marry you, and I will love you for every day we are given, however many or few, because I have learned this year that a life lived fully, however short, is worth infinitely more than a life spent merely surviving. Daniel taught me that, in the end, though it cost him everything to teach it." Graham slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled only slightly, and the stagecoach driver, who had indeed been listening quite intently despite his best efforts to appear otherwise, called back over his shoulder, "Congratulations, folks. Drinks are on me when we reach Cedar Hollow," which made both of them laugh, the tension of the moment breaking into something warm and light and entirely joyful. They were married in Cedar Hollow's small church on the first Saturday of November, 1878, with the whole town in attendance, and Sarah Prescott, Daniel's one-time sweetheart, now married herself and expecting her first child, stood as Helen's attendant, weeping happy tears throughout the ceremony and afterward telling Helen that Daniel would have been overjoyed to see his sister and his Marshal find their way to each other, out of all the grief the two of them had shared. Silas Boone gave Helen away, since she had no other family present to do it, and when Graham slipped the wedding band onto her finger and the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the whole town erupted into applause and cheering that echoed off the mountains, a sound of pure celebration in a town that had known, over the past 14 months, far too much sorrow. They held the reception at the Prescott boarding house, tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by nearly every family in Cedar Hollow, and as the afternoon wore into evening and the fiddle music started up in the yard, Graham found a quiet moment to lead Helen away from the celebration, out to the small cemetery at the edge of town, where Daniel's grave lay beneath a proper stone marker now, purchased with money the town council had raised in the weeks after Weller's capture. A gesture of gratitude for the boy who had died protecting 2 of their children. "I wanted him to know," Graham said simply, standing at the grave in his wedding clothes with his new wife's hand in his. "I wanted to bring you here today, of all days, so he could see what came of everything, in whatever way the dead see such things. Helen knelt at the grave and laid the small bouquet of wildflowers she had carried throughout the day gently against the stone. "We are happy, Daniel," she said softly. "I know that must seem strange, happiness growing up out of the very grief that brought me here, but it is true, and I think you would be glad of it, knowing how you were. I married your Marshall little brother. I married the man who buried his badge with you, and then found, in loving me, the courage to dig it back up again. I think that is the finest thing that could have come from such sorrow, and I choose to believe you are glad of it, wherever you are." They stood together a while longer in the fading light, and then walked back to the celebration, hand in hand, leaving behind them a grave that no longer held only grief, but had become, in some strange and hard-won way, a kind of foundation stone for everything good that had grown up around it since. They settled together on Graham's ranch, adding Helen's 60 acres to his own holdings the following spring, and within 2 years had built the largest and most respected horse breeding operation in the county. Graham's skill with troubled animals matched by Helen's careful eye for good breeding stock, and her hard-won practical sense, honed by years of running a business of her own. Graham continued to serve as Cedar Hollow's marshal for another 6 years, a steady, respected presence in a town that had, under his renewed watch, grown safer and more prosperous with each passing season, though he made certain always to deputize and train other capable men alongside him, remembering the lesson Daniel's death had taught him about the danger of any one person trying to carry too much alone. Their first child, a son, was born in the autumn of 1879, and they named him Daniel, after the uncle he would never meet but whose sacrifice had, in its own strange and roundabout way, brought his parents together. 2 more children followed over the years that came after, a daughter named Mary after Helen's mother, and a second son named Silas after old Boone, who wept openly when he learned of the honor and lived long enough to see the boy grow into a fine young man himself. Sarah Prescott and Helen became close friends over the years, their children growing up together, and on quiet evenings the 2 women would sometimes speak of Daniel, sharing memories, keeping his story alive in the particular way that women who have loved the same lost person often find themselves bound together across whatever distance grief might otherwise put between them. Graham never wore the original badge again, of course. It remained where he had left it, buried in the ground beside the young man who had taught him, even in death, the terrible cost and the equally terrible necessity of courage. But the new badge, the one Silas Boone had pinned to his vest on the day Reuben Weller rode back into Cedar Hollow, hung eventually in a place of honor above the mantel of the home Graham and Helen built together, a reminder not of failure, but of the long, hard road a person could walk from grief back toward purpose, if only they were brave enough and loved enough to make the journey. On the 10th anniversary of Daniel Sutton's death, Graham and Helen rode out to the cemetery together, as they did every year on that date, bringing their 3 children along for the first time old enough to understand something of what the visit meant. "This is your Uncle Daniel," Helen told her children, kneeling at the grave with her youngest, Silas, only 4 years old, held on her hip. "He was the bravest man I ever knew before I married your father, and he loved this town, and he loved me, and in the end he loved 2 little children he had never even met enough to give up everything to keep them safe. That is the finest thing a person can do in this world, children. Love something enough to be brave for it, even when being brave costs you everything you have." Young Daniel, 8 years old and solemn beyond his years, looked at the simple stone marker for a long moment. "Is that why you married Papa?" he asked. "Because Uncle Daniel was brave, and then Papa learned to be brave too because of him." Graham, standing behind his family with his hand resting gently on his wife's shoulder, felt his throat tighten with an emotion too large and too complicated for easy words. "Something very much like that," he said finally. "Your uncle taught me, even after he was gone, what it truly means to protect the people you love. I buried a great deal of my own fear and doubt in this very ground, right alongside him, on the worst day of my life. And I did not know then that loving your mother would be the thing that helped me learn to dig myself back out of that grief and become, in the end, a better man than I had been before. The wind moved through the cottonwoods above the cemetery, the same gentle, constant wind that had carried Graham's whispered promises to Daniel's grave a decade before, and the family stood together a while longer in the quiet autumn light. 3 generations of love and loss and hard-won happiness gathered around a single grave that had, over the years, come to represent not an ending, but a beginning. They rode home together as the sun set behind the mountains, Graham and Helen Trask and their 3 children, toward a ranch house full of warmth and laughter and the particular, hard-earned peace of 2 people who had found in each other exactly the kind of courage that grief alone could never have taught them, and who intended, for whatever years were left to them, to spend every single one grateful for it. That peace held for the rest of their days. Graham eventually passed the marshal's star to his own son Daniel, who grew into as fine and steady a lawman as Cedar Hollow had ever known, carrying forward a legacy that had been forged all those years before, out of tragedy and guilt, and finally, against every expectation, out of love. And on quiet evenings, long after the children had grown and married and given them grandchildren of their own to spoil, Graham and Helen Trask would sometimes sit together on the porch of the ranch house they had built with their own hands, watching the sun set over the grasslands that had once belonged to a young man named Daniel Sutton, and think, without sorrow now, only with a deep and abiding gratitude of the strange and winding road that had led them there together, hand in hand, exactly where they were always meant to be.